December 16, 1944. The morning mist hung thick over the Ardennes forest like a burial shroud. Private First Class Charles Chibity crouched in a frozen foxhole near the Belgian-German border, his SCR-300 radio crackling with static. His fingers, numb despite the wool gloves, gripped the handset while his other hand worked the frequency dial. Around him, the 4th Infantry Division's forward positions stretched in a thin, exhausted line. They had been fighting since June 6th, nearly 7 months of continuous combat through France, through hedgerows and forests, through towns whose names they could barely pronounce. Chibity had not slept in 36 hours. None of them had. Intelligence reports indicated German forces massing across the lines, but higher command dismissed the warnings. The Germans were finished, they said. The war would be over by Christmas. But Chibity, a Comanche from Oklahoma, knew better. He had learned to read terrain, to sense danger, from ancestors who had fought cavalry units across these same kinds of forests half a world away, and every instinct he possessed screamed that something catastrophic was about to happen. At 0500 hours, the world exploded. German artillery bombardment commenced along an 80-mile front, the largest concentration of firepower the Wehrmacht had assembled since the invasion of France in 1940. Shells tore through the ancient trees of the Ardennes, transforming the forest into a hellscape of splintered wood and frozen earth. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. When it finally ceased, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Then came the sound that every American soldier had learned to fear, the grinding mechanical thunder of German armor. Through gaps in the smoke and mist, Chibity could see them, Panzer Mark 5 Panthers, King Tigers, hundreds of them, supported by thousands of infantry in winter white camouflage. This was not a local counterattack. This was an entire army. 3 German field armies, totaling over 200,000 men, crashing through American lines in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The 4th Signal Company's wire lines were cut within minutes. Telephone communication, the primary method of battlefield coordination, was severed. Radio became the only link between forward units and divisional headquarters, but the Germans possessed something the Americans had feared since the beginning of the war. They had radio intercept units, Funkerabwehr, that could monitor Allied transmissions. They had cryptographers who could break American field codes, sometimes faster than American units could encode them. Every radio message sent in standard military cipher was a gift to German intelligence, revealing American positions, strength, and intentions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Captain James Earl, commanding officer of the 4th Signal Company, understood the mathematical reality facing them. Standard encoding procedures required 4 hours to encrypt a message properly, transmit it, and decode it at the receiving end. They did not possess 4 hours. The German advance was measured in minutes. American defensive positions were collapsing faster than headquarters could receive casualty reports. The entire 1st Army command structure was fragmenting under the weight of the German assault. Earl made a decision that violated every communications protocol in the United States Army manual. He called for Chibity and his partner, Private First Class Haddon Codina. Both men were Comanche code talkers, part of a group of 17 Native Americans recruited in December of 1940 specifically to develop an unbreakable communications system. Unlike the better-known Navajo code talkers serving in the Pacific, the Comanche program operated with minimal official recognition. The Army had given them basic radio training, assigned them to the 4th Infantry Division, and essentially told them to figure it out themselves. What they figured out was brilliant. The Comanche language was already incomprehensible to non-speakers. It was tonal, complex, with grammatical structures completely foreign to Indo-European languages. Only approximately 1,000 people on Earth spoke fluent Comanche, and the Germans had no recordings of it, no dictionaries, no linguistic experts who could even identify it. But the code talkers had gone further. They had developed 250 specialized military terms in Comanche for concepts that had no native equivalent. A tank became a wakarei, turtle. The bomber became Puhi Tahibu, pregnant bird. Adolf Hitler himself was Posa Taibu, crazy white man. A machine gun was a Poma Makani, sewing machine. More importantly, these terms were known only to the 17 code talkers themselves. Another Comanche speaker intercepting the transmission would hear the words but could not comprehend the military meaning. It was a code within a language within a code. And critically, it was fast. What took 4 hours using standard encryption took less than 3 minutes using Comanche code. But there was a problem. The Comanche code talkers were not officially authorized for use on this front. The program had been designed for the Pacific Theater against Japanese forces. Using them in Europe violated established chain-of-command protocols. Standard military communications doctrine required all messages to be transmitted using approved cipher systems so they could be logged, verified, and traced. The Comanche code bypassed all of these safeguards. If Earl ordered its use and the offensive failed, he would face court-martial for unauthorized communications procedures. Captain Earl looked at the burning forest around him. He looked at the German tanks, visible through the smoke. He made his choice. Use the Comanche code immediately and continuously. Ignore all standard encryption protocols. And pray that higher command would forgive him if they survived long enough to be court-martialed. At 06:45 hours, Chibiti transmitted the first Comanche-coded message of the Battle of the Bulge. The message went to 4th Division artillery batteries, positioned 8 miles behind the front lines. Chibiti's words, spoken in rapid Comanche, conveyed precise grid coordinates of German armor concentrations, strength estimates, and direction of advance. The entire transmission lasted 120 seconds. The artillery batteries, equipped with their own Comanche code talker to receive and translate, had shells in the air within 4 minutes of Chibiti's transmission. The impact was immediate. German tanks advancing through what they believed was a communications blackout suddenly found themselves under accurate artillery fire. Commanders expecting confusion and delay instead encountered coordinated resistance. The American 4th Infantry Division, which should have been routed within hours, held its positions. Not through superior numbers or equipment, but through superior communication speed. By 0800 hours, German Funkabwehr units had intercepted dozens of American radio transmissions. Their cryptographers, some of the most skilled in the world, began analysis. What they heard defied comprehension. It was not English. It was not any language in their extensive databases. The phonetic patterns matched nothing in Indo-European, Slavic, or Asian language families they had studied. Some analysts initially believed it was a machine-generated random cipher. Others thought it might be a new form of voice encryption device. None suspected it was human speech in a Native American language spoken by approximately 1,000 people in Oklahoma. The German 16th Infantry Regiment, advancing toward the town of Sankt Vith, encountered what their after-action report described as impossibly coordinated American artillery response. American guns seemed to know German positions before German commanders had transmitted them. Counterattacks appeared at exactly the point where German lines were weakest. The Americans, who should have been in chaos, were fighting with the precision of a force that possessed complete battlefield awareness. Oberst Wilhelm Osterhold, commanding the German 348th Volksgrenadier Division, transmitted an urgent message to higher command at 0930 hours. The Americans possess a new communications technology we cannot intercept or decode. Request immediate signals intelligence support. The response came back within an hour. All available Funkabwehr assets were being redirected to solve this mystery. The best German cryptographers, men who had broken British naval codes and Soviet diplomatic ciphers, focused their entire effort on decoding the American transmissions. They never succeeded. Not that day. Not during the entire Battle of the Bulge. Not during the rest of the war. Because Charles Chibiti and his fellow Comanche code talkers were not using technology or ciphers or encryption devices. They were using their grandmother's language, passed down through generations, now weaponized to defeat the most sophisticated military machine in European history. The German offensive continued for weeks. But on that crucial first day, when the entire American defensive position in the Ardennes hung by the thinnest thread, the Comanche Code provided the communication speed that prevented complete collapse. While other American units fell back in confusion, unable to coordinate responses, the 4th Infantry Division held. They held because their commanders received intelligence in minutes instead of hours. They held because artillery fire could be called with precision that seemed almost supernatural to German forces, accustomed to American communication delays. They held because one Comanche radioman, violating every protocol in the military handbook, used an illegal code that happened to be his native language. But the true cost of that decision would not become clear until dawn. Dawn broke over the Ardennes on December 17th, with the kind of cold that made men question whether freezing to death might be preferable to another day of combat. Charles Chibity had been transmitting continuously for 14 hours. His voice was hoarse, his throat raw from speaking Comanche into frozen air. The radio handset had become an extension of his hand, and he could no longer feel his fingers properly, but he kept transmitting because the alternative was unthinkable. The situation had evolved in ways Captain Earl had not anticipated. Word of the Comanche Code's effectiveness spread through 4th Infantry Division Command faster than German tanks advanced through Belgian villages. By mid-morning of the 17th, Chibity was receiving requests, not just from artillery batteries, but from battalion commanders, tank destroyers, supply officers, even medics trying to coordinate casualty evacuation. Everyone wanted the fast, secure communication that only the code talkers could provide. The problem was there were only 2 Comanche speakers in the immediate sector, Chibity and Codina. 17 code talkers existed in total across the entire European theatre, scattered among different divisions. Most were positioned along quiet sectors of the front line where their skills had seemed unnecessary. Now, with the German offensive tearing a 50-mile gap in American lines, those 17 men suddenly represented the most valuable communications asset the army possessed. But gathering them together would take days they did not have. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hogan, commanding the 4th Infantry Division's artillery, recognized the mathematical impossibility of the situation at 0700 hours on December 17th. He needed to coordinate fire support across 12 battery positions simultaneously. Each fire mission required precise communication of targets, timing, and ammunition types. Using standard encryption, his staff could manage perhaps 3 coordinated missions per hour. The Germans were advancing faster than that. Hogan called for Chibity directly, bypassing the normal chain of command. What followed was a conversation that would never appear in official army records, but would be recounted by survivors for decades. Hogan asked Chibity a simple question. How many messages can you transmit per hour? Chibity's answer. As many as you need, sir. Until my voice gives out or the Germans kill me. Whichever comes first. For the next 6 hours, Chibity became the central nervous system of 4th Infantry Division's defensive response. He transmitted artillery coordinates, received confirmation, relayed ammunition status, coordinated infantry, movements, and maintained communication between isolated units that had been cut off by German advances. His transmissions averaged 1 every 4 minutes. By comparison, a standard encrypted message took 45 minutes from composition to reception. But the strain was beginning to show, not just on Chibity, but on the entire improvised system. The Comanche Code had been developed for simple tactical messages. Enemy positions, unit movements, basic commands. Now it was being used for complex logistics, medical terminology, technical specifications of German equipment that the code talkers had never been trained to describe. Chibity found himself inventing new code words on the spot, hoping the receiving code talker would understand his improvisation. A tank destroyer is a turtle killer. A supply depot became a food place. Casualties requiring immediate evacuation became broken warriors who need the flying turtle, their term for ambulances. The code was evolving in real time, becoming more elaborate and more vulnerable to misunderstanding. Each improvisation increased the risk that a message might be misinterpreted at the receiving end, potentially sending artillery shells into American positions or routing reinforcements to the wrong coordinates. At 1300 hours, the first mistake happened. Chibity transmitted coordinates for a German armor concentration near the village of Trois Ponts. The receiving code talker, exhausted and unfamiliar with Chibity's improvised terminology, misheard one number in the grid reference. American artillery shells landed 800 meters from the intended target, hitting an abandoned farmhouse instead of German tanks. No Americans were killed, but the error revealed the system's fragility. Captain Earl, monitoring the transmissions, faced his second impossible decision of the battle. The Comanche code was working, but it was also breaking down under the volume and complexity of messages. Standard military protocol would be to cease using the unauthorized system, return to approved encryption methods, accept the slower communication speed as the price of reliability. But standard military protocol had not anticipated an offensive of this magnitude. Earl made a calculation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the code talkers to continue transmitting, but he also ordered every message to be logged and verified by a second radio operator using conventional methods whenever possible. This created redundancy, catching errors before they became fatal. But it also meant exposing American positions through conventional radio traffic that the Germans could intercept. He was using his soldiers as bait. The fast, secure Comanche transmissions would carry the real operational messages. The slower conventional transmissions would be partially accurate but deliberately delayed, giving Germans outdated information that might draw them into prepared American defensive positions. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, and it required the code talkers to keep transmitting while knowing that every conventional message sent alongside theirs was potentially drawing German fire toward their positions. The German response came at 1500 hours. Funkerbear units, unable to decode the mysterious American transmissions, shifted strategy. If they could not break the code, they would locate and eliminate the transmitters. Radio direction-finding teams began triangulating the source of Comanche transmissions. German artillery batteries received priority orders: suppress American radio positions at all costs. Chibity's foxhole took its first direct hit at 1545 hours. A German 105mm shell struck 30 meters away, close enough that the concussion lifted him bodily and slammed him against the frozen earth. His radio was damaged but functional. His hearing in his left ear was gone, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that would never, completely fade. He checked his body for wounds, found none serious, and resumed transmitting. The second shell hit at 1600 hours. This one is closer, 20 meters. Shrapnel tore through his position, destroying the radio's antenna. Chibity switched to a backup unit, a heavier SCR 600 that required 2 men to operate properly. He managed alone, propping the set against the foxhole wall, adjusting frequencies with bloody fingers while speaking into the handset in steady, measured Comanche. By 1630 hours, German artillery had ranged in his exact position. Shells were landing in a pattern, walking toward him with mathematical precision. Every soldier in the vicinity understood what was happening. The radio operator had been marked for elimination. Standard battlefield practice was to cease transmitting, relocate, establish a new position. But Chibity was in the middle of coordinating a counterattack by the 4th Infantry Division's Reserve Battalion. If he stopped transmitting, the counterattack would fail. If he continued, he would die. Private Codina, monitoring the situation from a secondary position 200 meters away, called Chibity on a backup frequency. The conversation lasted 15 seconds. Codina offered to take over transmission duties, allowing Chibity to evacuate. Chibity refused. His position had better sightlines for observing German movements. Moving the radio would create a gap in communication at the exact moment when coordination was most critical. He would continue transmitting until the mission was complete, or until German shells completed their inevitable work. What happened next became one of those moments that soldiers remember with perfect clarity decades later, while forgetting entire weeks of combat. At 1645 hours, with German artillery shells impacting within 10 meters of his position, Charles Chibity transmitted coordinates for American artillery to fire on his own foxhole. had spotted German infantry advancing through the smoke and debris, using the artillery barrage as cover to assault his position directly. Approximately 50 soldiers, moving fast, would overrun his foxhole within 3 minutes. If they captured him alive, they might capture the radio codes, the frequency settings, perhaps even force him to provide information about the Comanche system. That could not be allowed to happen. So Chibity called down American artillery on his own coordinates. He transmitted the grid reference, confirmed the target, and added a final instruction in Comanche that the receiving code talker understood immediately. Fire for effect. Maximum intensity. Commence in 2 minutes. Then he destroyed his codebook. The small notebook containing frequency assignments and code word definitions was burned in the bottom of his foxhole. The radio's frequency crystal was smashed and buried. He kept only the handset, wrapped in his jacket, protected against his chest. If he survived, he could rebuild. If he died, the Germans would find nothing useful. The American artillery barrage began at 16:47 hours. Shells from 12 batteries, coordinated by Chibity's final transmission, converged on a 100-meter square of Ardennes forest that contained 1 Comanche radioman and 50 German infantry. The bombardment lasted 4 minutes. The sound was indescribable, a physical force that turned air into pressure and ground into liquid motion. When the shelling ceased, medics found Chibity unconscious, buried under 2 feet of frozen earth and shattered trees, still clutching the radio handset. His back was broken in 3 places. His right leg was shattered, both eardrums were ruptured. But he was breathing, and when the medics dug him out, the first thing he did was try to transmit a status report. The German infantry that had been advancing on his position no longer existed. 47 bodies were recovered from the impact zone. The remaining 3 were found wounded, surrendering without resistance. The German artillery that had been targeting Chibity's position ceased firing shortly after, either destroyed by counter-battery fire or redeployed to other sectors. The 4th Infantry Division's counterattack, coordinated by Chibity's transmissions, recaptured 600 meters of ground and stabilized the defensive line at a critical junction. Captain Earl visited Chibity in the field hospital 12 hours later. The conversation was brief because Chibity could barely hear and could not speak above a whisper. Earl informed him that the unauthorized use of Comanche code had been officially sanctioned retroactively by 1st Army Command. There would be no court-martial, no disciplinary action. The code talkers were being formally integrated into communications doctrine across the entire European theatre. He also informed Chibity of something else, something that would not become public knowledge for another 32 years. During the first 48 hours of the Battle of the Bulge, while communication systems collapsed across the American front, the 4th Infantry Division's sector held, not because of superior numbers or equipment or tactical brilliance, but because 17 Comanche code talkers maintained communication when every other system failed. Intelligence estimates suggested that this communication advantage had prevented German breakthroughs at the northern shoulder of the offensive, forcing them to redirect forces southward, where American resistance was weaker. Those redirected forces, approximately 5,000 German soldiers and their supporting armor, had been delayed by 6 to 8 hours, while German command tried to understand why the northern sector had not collapsed as planned. That delay had allowed American reinforcements to reach defensive positions. It had allowed Patton's Third Army to begin its relief operation toward Bastogne. It had, in the assessment of post-war analysis, potentially prevented the German offensive from reaching the Meuse River and achieving its strategic objectives. 5,000 Germans stopped, not by bullets or bombs, but by the communication advantage provided by one radioman's illegal code that happened to be his native language. Chibity survived his injuries, though he would walk with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life, and his hearing never fully recovered. He received the Bronze Star for valor, though the citation was deliberately vague about the specific actions that earned it. The full details of the Comanche Code Talker program remained classified until 1968, and even then, the story emerged slowly, overshadowed by the more famous Navajo Code Talkers of the Pacific. But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, when the most powerful military offensive Germany could mount crashed against American lines, it was Charles Chibity and 16 other Comanche speakers who provided the invisible shield that held. They fought with words instead of weapons, with grammar instead of grenades, with a language that had survived centuries of attempted erasure now being used to defeat the army that had perfected the art of erasure. And when historians later analyzed the Battle of the Bulge, trying to understand how American forces had withstood the initial shock of the German assault, they would point to leadership, to terrain, to weather, to logistics. All true, all important. But none of it would have mattered if commanders could not communicate with their forces, if artillery could not receive coordinates, if isolated units could not call for support. The battle was won by many factors, but it was saved in those first crucial hours by a Comanche radioman who violated every protocol, called artillery down on his own position, and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that allows you to talk to your brothers when the world is ending around you. The true cost of Captain Earl's decision was not a court-martial or a career ended. It was simpler and more profound. One man was broken in body, bearing wounds that would never fully heal, who had traded his physical wholeness for the preservation of his brothers in arms. And he would make that same choice again, without hesitation, because that is what warriors do when their people need them. The Ardennes remembered. The frozen earth remembered. And decades later, when the full story could finally be told, the world would remember that the code that could not be broken was not a code at all. It was home. March 1945. 3 months after the Battle of the Bulge. Charles Chibity sat in a military hospital in Paris, staring at forms he could not legally complete. The paperwork was simple enough, a request for disability compensation, requiring detailed description of injuries sustained in combat, but the section, demanding explanation of how those injuries occurred, remained blank. Because explaining meant revealing the Comanche Code Talker program, and the Comanche Code Talker program was classified at a level that superseded a soldier's right to document his own destruction. The doctor who had treated Chibity's injuries knew only that he had been caught in artillery fire. The medical records listed his condition as combat trauma, multiple fragmentation wounds, spinal damage. No mention of why he had remained in position while German shells walked toward him. No explanation of why he had called down fire on his own coordinates. Those details were locked behind classification barriers that would not be lifted for another 23 years. Across the European theatre, similar scenes played out in hospital wards and discharge centres. 17 Comanche code talkers had entered the Battle of the Bulge. 14 survived. Of those 14, 9 carried injuries that would mark them for life, but none could fully explain how they had been wounded, because explaining meant revealing why they had been targeted with such precision by German artillery. The Funkabwehr had never broken their code, but they had certainly identified code talker radio positions as high-value targets worth dedicated suppression efforts. Private Haddon Codina, Chibity's partner during those first desperate hours of December 16th, had been killed on December 23rd. A German sniper had identified his radio antenna, tracked the transmission source, and fired a single shot that ended Codina's life mid-sentence. He had been transmitting coordinates for a medical evacuation when he died. The message was completed by another code talker 30 minutes later, after Codina's body had been removed from his position and his radio equipment salvaged. The soldiers who needed evacuation never knew that the man coordinating their rescue had died in the process. Codina's family received a telegram, in January. Killed in action. No further details provided. They would never know that their son had been specifically targeted because he possessed a skill that made him more dangerous to the enemy than any rifle or machine gun. They would never know that German intelligence had classified Comanche radio operators as priority neutralization targets, starting December 18, 1944. They would never know because telling them would compromise operational security for a program that was still active, still sending Native American soldiers into combat with targets painted on their backs by their own linguistic heritage. The official history of the 4th Infantry Division, published in 1946, made no mention of Comanche code talkers. The after-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge credited innovative communications procedures with maintaining unit cohesion during the German offensive. Innovative. That was the word chosen to describe men who had used their grandmother's language to save thousands of lives while simultaneously marking themselves for elimination. Captain James Earl returned to civilian life in late 1945. He never spoke publicly about his decision to authorize the Comanche Code. When asked about his service in the Ardennes, he would say only that he had been fortunate to command good soldiers who did difficult work under impossible conditions. The moral weight of his choice, ordering men to use a skill that would make them targets, knowing that their deaths could not even be properly acknowledged, manifested in ways his family would only recognize decades later. He drank. Not dramatically, not in ways that destroyed his civilian career, but consistently. A man trying to drown something he could not name, because naming it was still classified. The pattern repeated across the military hierarchy. Officers who had witnessed the code talker's effectiveness, who had seen the tactical advantage provided by unbreakable rapid communication, were prohibited from discussing it. Some wrote personal journals, carefully coded language that avoided specific details. Others said nothing, carrying the knowledge like shrapnel lodged too close to vital organs to be safely removed. By 1950, most Americans had heard of the Navajo code talkers. The Pacific Campaign's use of Native American languages had been partially declassified, celebrated in newspaper articles and official recognition ceremonies. The Navajo Code had been crucial to Marine operations across dozens of Pacific islands. Their story was heroic, clear, uncomplicated by European politics or German technological sophistication. The Comanche code talkers received nothing. Their program remained fully classified because European operations were still being analyzed, because Cold War intelligence priorities required maintaining uncertainty about what communication methods had been used against German forces, because bureaucratic inertia is easier than justice. The men who had saved the northern shoulder of the Bulge returned to Oklahoma in silence, forbidden from explaining their service, even to their own communities. Charles Chibity returned to Tulsa in June 1945. He was 23 years old, walked with a cane, and suffered from hearing loss that would worsen throughout his life. He took a job with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, working on land management issues. He married, had children, attended church, participated in Comanche cultural events. He was, by all external measures, a normal veteran, reintegrating into civilian society. But several times a year, he would receive visits from military intelligence officers, always polite, always professional, always delivering the same message. The Code Talker program remains classified. You are still bound by your security oath. Discuss nothing about communications procedures used during the war. These visits continued through the 1950s, into the 60s, a constant reminder that his service was simultaneously invaluable and unspeakable. The psychological toll of enforced silence is difficult to quantify. Veterans traditionally process trauma through storytelling, through sharing experiences with others who understand. The Comanche code talkers could not do this. They could not gather and discuss what they had endured. They could not seek counseling for combat experiences they were forbidden from describing. They could not even explain to their children why their father sometimes woke screaming in Comanche, transmitting phantom radio messages to units that no longer existed. In 1968, the Comanche Code Talker program was finally declassified, 23 years after the war ended. The announcement was brief, buried in military records releases, generating minimal public attention. By that point, 3 of the original 17 code talkers had died. Several others were in poor health. The moment for recognition had passed, overwhelmed by Vietnam, by civil rights struggles, by a nation that had moved on from World War II and had little interest in the resurrection of minor footnotes about Native American soldiers who had done something important with radios in a forest most Americans could not locate on a map. Charles Chibity attended the first official recognition ceremony in 1989. He was 67 years old, his hearing almost completely gone. his back so damaged from that December afternoon in the Ardennes that he could not stand for more than a few minutes without pain. The ceremony was held in Washington, organized by Native American veterans groups after decades of advocacy. 11 surviving code talkers attended. They received medals, certificates of appreciation, handshakes from officials who had not been born when Chibiti had called artillery down on his own position. The ceremony was dignified and respectful. It was also 45 years, too late. 45 years during which these men had carried their service in silence, watching the Navajo code talkers receive recognition while they remained invisible. 45 years during which Haddon Codina's family had never learned the true circumstances of his death. 45 years during which Captain James Earl had drunk himself into an early grave, taking his guilt about the unauthorized code to his death in 1972. After the ceremony, reporters asked Chibiti how it felt to finally receive recognition for his wartime service. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. When he spoke, it was in English, not Comanche. Some things, he had learned, were too important to risk being misunderstood. "We did our job," he said. "That's all. We used the language our grandmothers gave us to help our brothers. We would do it again. But I wish." He paused, considering whether to continue. Then, with the kind of honesty that only comes from men, who have already lost everything that can be taken, "I wish we could have talked about it. With each other. While we were all still alive. While we could still remember what it meant to be young and scared and speaking our language into a radio while the world ended around us." The reporter asked a follow-up question about the specific operations where the Comanche code had been used. Chibiti smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. "I can tell you now," he said. "I'm allowed. But who's left to care? The men who fought with us are mostly gone. The Germans we fought against are mostly gone. The officers who sent us into position, knowing we'd become targets, they're gone too. There's just us, the few that survived, telling stories to people who weren't there and can't really understand." He was not bitter. Bitterness requires the energy to maintain anger, and Chibiti had expended that energy decades ago. He was simply tired. Tired of carrying stories he had not been allowed to tell. Tired of watching the narrative of World War II solidify into accepted history that had no room for 17 Comanche speakers who had changed the outcome of a crucial battle by using a language the American government had once tried to eliminate through forced boarding schools and cultural suppression. The irony was not lost on him. The United States government had spent 50 years trying to erase Native American languages through systematic education policies designed to kill the Indian, save the man. Comanche children had been beaten for speaking their native language in government schools. Chibiti's own mother had been forced to attend such a school, emerging with trauma she never fully articulated. And then, when the government needed an unbreakable code, they turned to those same suppressed languages and asked the survivors of cultural genocide to save the nation that had tried to destroy their culture. And they did, not because they had forgotten the injustices, not because they had forgiven the systematic attempts at erasure, but because when their country called, when their brothers in arms needed them, they answered. Because that is what warriors do, even when the nation they serve has not always treated them as full citizens, deserving of dignity and recognition. Charles Chibiti died in 1995, 50 years and 7 months after the end of World War II. His obituary in the Tulsa newspaper mentioned his military service, his work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, his family. There was one paragraph about his role as a Comanche code talker, describing it as important communications work during the Battle of the Bulge. The article did not mention that he had called artillery fire on his own position. It did not mention the 45 years of enforced silence. It did not mention that the security clearance required for his wartime service had outlived him, expiring only upon his death. At his funeral, the remaining Comanche code talkers gathered. Only 6 survived at that point. They spoke in Comanche, sharing memories that could finally be voiced without fear of classification, violations, or security concerns. They remembered Haddon Codina, dead for 50 years but still present in their recollections. They remembered the cold, the fear, the mathematical certainty that transmitting meant becoming a target. They remembered the sound of German artillery walking toward their positions with mechanical precision. They remembered continuing to transmit anyway, because stopping meant their brothers would die. And they remembered the language, the tonal complexity, the grammatical structures, the words their grandmothers had taught them that became weaponized terminology for modern warfare. Wakarie, puhihui tahibu, posa taibu, words that had saved thousands of lives while simultaneously marking their speakers for death. The funeral service concluded with a honor guard firing a 21 gun salute. The sound of rifles firing in coordinated volleys echoed across the Oklahoma landscape where Chibiti had learned to speak Comanche as a child. The same landscape where his grandmother had taught him the words he would one day use to save an army. The volleys continued, precise and ceremonial, nothing like the random chaos of artillery fire in the Ardennes. But the surviving code talkers flinched anyway, instinctive reactions that 5 decades had not erased. After the service, one of the younger attendees, a Comanche man in his 30s, approached the surviving code talkers. He asked them a question that had been bothering him since learning about the program. Why had they volunteered? They had known the risks. They had known they would become priority targets. They had known the government that recruited them was the same government that had tried to suppress their language. Why agree to serve? The code talkers looked at each other, a moment of silent communication that needed no radio transmission. Finally, one of them answered. Because, he said simply, it was the only time in our lives that speaking Comanche made us heroes instead of problems. That answer contained multitudes. It contained the entire history of forced assimilation, of government boarding schools, of systematic cultural suppression. It contained the pride of using a forbidden language to achieve what the enemy's best cryptographers could not break. It contained the bitter recognition that their value to the nation had been temporary, tactical, forgotten as soon as the immediate crisis passed. But it also contained something else, a profound statement about identity, about cultural survival, about the strange reversals of history where the suppressed becomes the essential. For a brief moment in 1944, in the frozen forests of Belgium, being Comanche had been exactly what America needed, not in spite of their indigenous identity but because of it, not as curiosities or noble savages or romantic symbols, but as tactical assets whose specific skills could not be replicated by any other population on Earth. That recognition had come too late for some, like Haddon Codina. It had come incomplete for others, like Charles Chibiti, who spent 45 years unable to speak about the most significant events of his life. But it had come. Eventually. Partially. Enough to place a marker on history noting that something important had happened, that lives had been saved, that a language scheduled for extinction had instead become instrumental in preserving freedom. The Comanche language is endangered today. Fewer than 100 fluent speakers remain, most of them elderly. Efforts to preserve and revitalize the language continue, but the trajectory is concerning. Within a generation or two, Comanche might become another extinct indigenous language, remembered only in academic studies and historical records. If that happens, the irony will be complete. The language that proved unbreakable to German cryptographers will have been broken by time, by cultural pressure, by the same forces of assimilation that created the circumstances requiring its weaponization in the first place. Future generations might read about the Comanche code talkers the way we read about medieval warfare, interesting, important in historical context, but fundamentally disconnected from lived experience. But for now, while a handful of speakers remain, the words still exist. Wakare'e, puhihui tahibu, po mamakani, turtle, pregnant bird, sewing machine. Code words developed in desperation, used in crisis, classified for decades, finally revealed to a world that had mostly stopped paying attention. And somewhere in the archives of the 4th Infantry Division, in documents that were classified for 23 years and are now simply old, there exists a communication log from December 16, 1944. 06:45 hours. Radio transmission in unknown language. Duration, 120 seconds. Result: artillery on target. Enemy advance. Halted. Unknown language. After everything, after the recognition ceremonies and the medals and the acknowledgements, that's what the official record says. Unknown language. Because the clerks who logged the transmissions were not cleared to know about the Comanche code. Because bureaucracy outlives memory. Because the most important details are often the ones that get classified, archived, forgotten. But Charles Chibity knew. And Haddon Codiner knew, in those final seconds before a German sniper's bullet ended his transmission. And the handful of surviving code talkers know, carrying the weight of service that saved thousands and cost them the ability to speak about their most significant contribution until decades after it mattered. They know that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that allows you to communicate when. Communication means survival. They know that language is not just a tool but an inheritance, a responsibility, a connection to ancestors who could not have imagined their words would one day be used to defeat the most sophisticated military machine in European history. And they know that the true cost of silence is not just the stories that go untold, but the recognition that comes too late, the gratitude that arrives when most of those who deserve it are already gone, and the quiet acknowledgement that their service, however crucial, was always going to be a footnote in a history written by others. That knowledge is the final burden the code talkers carried. Not the physical wounds, though those were real and permanent. Not the psychological trauma, though that was profound and lasting, but the understanding that they had done something extraordinary that would be remembered as ordinary, classified as mundane, acknowledged only after the moment had passed and the witnesses had died, and the world had moved on to newer crises, requiring different solutions. 5,000 Germans stopped by one radioman's illegal code. But also, 17 young men marked for death by their grandmother's language, 14 survivors carrying classified secrets they could not share, 45 years of enforced silence, and finally, belatedly, inadequately, recognition. The Ardennes remember. The frozen earth remembers. And now, perhaps, the rest of us can remember too. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to acknowledge that heroes do not always wear their heroism in ways we recognize immediately. Sometimes they speak it in languages we do not understand, transmit it on frequencies we cannot hear, and carry it in silence until the day they die. That was the price of the unbreakable code. Not just what it cost to use, but what it cost to have used it, and then be forbidden from speaking about it until everyone who cared was gone. And yet, if you asked Charles Chibity, if you could somehow reach across the decades and pose the question to that young man crouched in a frozen foxhole with German shells walking toward him, he would give the same answer he gave at every recognition ceremony, in every interview, in every moment when someone asked if it had been worth it. We did our job. We used the language our grandmothers gave us. We would do it again. Not because the recognition came, not because the government properly honored their service, not because history recorded their contribution with appropriate detail and context, but because when their brothers needed them, they answered, in Comanche, until their voices gave out, or the Germans killed them, whichever came first. That is the story of how one radioman's illegal code stopped 5,000 Germans before dawn. And also the story of how that same radioman spent the rest of his life unable to fully explain what he had done, why it mattered, or what it cost him to do it. The code was unbreakable. The silence afterward was worse. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.